There are some places where the darkness doesn't just cover the land, it hides within the walls, in the corners of your mind, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. But what happens when it finds you, and you can no longer escape its suffocating grasp? It was just another quiet night in Ashford, a small town tucked away in the rolling hills of the countryside, a place where the hustle and bustle of the world seemed to slow to a crawl, where the silence wrapped around everything like a thick, comfortable blanket. The streets were empty, the wind barely stirring the leaves in the trees. The only sounds were the faint rustling of branches and the occasional chirp of a distant cricket. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows across the road, stretching them like fingers reaching out into the dark. The night was peaceful, almost idyllic, except for the gnawing feeling that had been creeping into Marissa's chest over the past few weeks. Marissa stood in front of her bedroom window, gazing out into the inky blackness. Her breath fogged up the glass as she leaned in closer, her face inches away from the cool surface. Her eyes were drawn to the dark shapes of the trees swaying gently in the wind, their branches twisting in the dim moonlight like skeletal fingers. It was a scene she had seen 100 times before, and yet tonight it seemed different. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow, as though something was pressing down on the world. The stillness of the town had always been comforting to her, but tonight it was suffocating. There was an unnatural quiet that made the silence feel deafening, and deep inside she knew something was wrong. She had always been a rational person. She didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural forces, but lately there had been things, strange occurrences, that she couldn't explain. At first it had been subtle, a creak in the floorboards when she was alone in the house, a fleeting shadow in the corner of her eye that vanished when she turned to look. But the incidents had become more frequent, more persistent. She had tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, that the house was old, and old houses made noises. But the whispers were something else. It started small. Late at night, when everything in the house was still, Marissa would hear soft murmurs, faint, unintelligible sounds coming from somewhere within the walls. At first she thought it was just the wind, or maybe the pipes creaking, but no matter where she went in the house, the sounds followed. They would fade when she moved from one room to the next, but they always came back. Always. Her thoughts drifted back to the first time she had heard them. So faint at first, she thought she might have imagined it. She had been sitting in her living room reading a book. The house had been silent, save for the occasional crackling of the fire. She had leaned forward, squinting at the words on the page, when the sound had reached her ears. A soft, almost imperceptible murmur, like someone whispering just outside the window. She had jumped, her heart thudding in her chest, but when she looked around, there was no one there. The silence returned, but something inside her had shifted. The unease had settled in, like a seed planted deep in her chest, growing with each passing day. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they had changed. They grew louder, more distinct, as if they were deliberately trying to get her attention. Marissa. Marissa. The name was always the same, a low, familiar voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the house, drifting through the walls, winding around her thoughts. Sometimes, when she was alone in her room, she could swear she heard it coming from right behind her, a breath on the back of her neck, cold and clammy. But when she spun around, there was nothing there, nothing but the empty room, the shadows stretching across the floor. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight the house felt colder. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing in on her like a heavy weight. She could feel it in her chest, the tightness that had been building ever since she heard the first knock. It had been soft at first, barely a tap against the door. but it had echoed through the silent house with such finality that it sent a wave of panic crashing over her. Who could be knocking at this hour? No one ever came by this late in Ashford. Everyone she knew was long asleep, tucked away in their beds. She hesitated, standing motionless for a moment, listening. The house was quiet again, the eerie stillness pressing in around her like an invisible force. The soft knock came again, this time louder, sharper, as if someone, or something, was growing impatient. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor or a late-night visitor. No, this was different. This felt purposeful. It felt like it was for her. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as she slowly moved toward the door. Her legs felt heavy, each step slower than the last. She didn't want to open it. Something inside her screamed at her to stay away, to lock the door and forget about it. But curiosity and fear drove her forward. She reached for the doorknob with shaking hands, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt like time had slowed, each second stretching into eternity as she grasped the cold metal. Before she could turn the knob, the voice came again. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, clearer. "Marissa, open the door. We know you're in there." The voice was so familiar, so close, it sent a shiver down her spine. Her name. It was spoken with such certainty, such intimacy, that it was as if the person, or thing, on the other side had been watching her for years, waiting for her. Marissa's heart skipped a beat. The voice was wrong. It was wrong in a way she couldn't explain. It didn't sound like anyone she knew, but it felt like it should. Her name, wrapped in that voice, made her skin crawl. It was like an old memory resurfacing, one that she hadn't wanted to remember. She stood frozen for a moment, paralyzed by the chilling realization that she wasn't alone in the house. Her eyes flickered to the dark corners of the room, but nothing moved. The shadows remained still, unmoving, yet she could feel them closing in, tightening around her. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as panic set in. A knock sounded again, louder this time, rattling the doorframe. It was like a fist slamming against the wood, demanding entry. Marissa took a step back, her mind racing. What should I do? Should she call the police? But no one would believe her. They would think she was crazy. She had no proof, no explanation for the whispers, the knocks, the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, the door handle turned. It twisted on its own, slowly, deliberately. The lock clicked open with a soft, sickening sound. Marissa gasped, her entire body frozen in terror. Her hand shot to her mouth to stifle a scream. Her thoughts were scattered, her mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. The door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A darkness so thick, it seemed to devour the light from the hallway. The air was cold, impossibly cold, and she could feel it biting at her skin. The darkness stretched forward like a living thing, creeping into the room, pulling the light away. And then, she saw it, a figure. It was standing just beyond the threshold, its form indistinct, as if it were made of shadows. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, waiting, watching. Marissa's pulse raced, the blood pounding in her ears. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of there, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her body trembling with fear. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. Whatever it was watching her, and she could feel its gaze burrowing into her, searching for something, waiting for something. And then, in a voice so cold it could have been a whisper from the grave, the figure spoke. "You can't hide from me, Marissa. You never could." It was just another quiet night in Ashford, the kind of place where the mundane beauty of small-town life seemed to hum in the background, barely noticed by those who lived there. The streets were so still that it was as if time itself had slowed down. Every house stood like a monument to calm, framed by dark trees whose branches swayed lazily in the breeze. The moon hung high above the town, its silver glow casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the quiet streets, elongating as the night deepened. Ashford was the kind of town where you knew everyone and everyone knew you. It was a place where secrets were few and life moved at a pace slower than anywhere else in the world. But that night, something felt wrong. Marissa stood by the window in her bedroom, looking out into the inky blackness of the town below. Her breath misted the glass as she leaned in closer, staring at the streetlights flickering in the distance. The world outside seemed suspended in time, every movement eerily synchronized with the rhythm of her own breathing. The night was peaceful. Yes, too peaceful. It was the kind of stillness that made you wonder whether something was waiting to disturb it. She had lived in Ashford for most of her life, but lately it felt different. The town she had once found charming now felt stifling, as though the walls of the world were closing in around her. Marissa had always found comfort in the quiet, the soft hum of a sleepy town, the gentle rustle of leaves. But over the past few weeks, the silence had started to feel wrong. It was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. Marissa had tried to push the feeling aside. She chalked it up to stress, to the weight of everyday life, but deep inside, she knew it was more than that. There had been things, small things at first, things she dismissed as nothing more than her imagination running wild. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow that seemed to dart just out of her field of vision, and the whispers. Oh, the whispers. Those had been the worst. It started innocuously enough. Late one night, when the house was dead quiet, she heard a faint sound. At first, it was just the wind, she thought. A soft rustling, the kind you only notice when you're trying to fall asleep. But as the nights passed, the sound grew clearer. It was no longer just a breeze or the house settling. It was something, someone, whispering her name, soft at first, like a breath on the back of her neck. Marissa. She had stiffened the first time it happened. It was so quiet, barely audible, that she convinced herself it was nothing. The wind, the creak of the floorboards, a trick of the mind. But it happened again, and again. Each time, it grew closer, more distinct, until one night she could hear it plainly, a voice low and cold. Marissa. Marissa had bolted upright, the room spinning as she glanced around in panic. But there was nothing there. The silence returned, as if mocking her. It's just the house settling, she had told herself. But even as she thought the words, she knew they were hollow. She could feel it, the weight of the presence, the pressure in the air that made it difficult to breathe. Then came the knocks. At first, it was just a faint tapping, something she barely noticed in the dead of night, but each knock came with more intensity, louder, sharper, unmistakable. She would wake to the sound of them, hollow taps on the front door, as if someone or something was waiting outside. And yet, when she checked, no one was there. She had locked every door, every window, but the knocks persisted. Sometimes they came from the front door, sometimes from the back. Other times it sounded like they were coming from the walls themselves, impossibly from within the very house. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. She couldn't quite explain it, but she could feel it in her bones. Something was different. The air inside her room was heavier, the shadows longer, more oppressive. The knocking was sharper now, more insistent. It echoed in the otherwise silent house, each tap reverberating through the wooden floors like a heartbeat. Marissa turned away from the window, feeling the familiar prickle of fear crawl up her spine. Her hand clenched around the edge of the windowsill, her knuckles turning white. She stood there for a moment, heart hammering in her chest, listening to the sound of the house breathing, the creaks of the old timbers settling beneath her feet. The town outside seemed to be holding its breath, and in that moment, so was she. The knock came again, louder this time. Who could be knocking at this hour? The thought flitted through her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. Ashford wasn't a place where visitors showed up unannounced, especially not at this hour. The only people who ever knocked at her door were family, and they all lived far away. So why? Her eyes drifted nervously to the door. The hallway beyond was dark, its shadows long and stretching, and her heart beat faster, the pounding in her chest, now a steady drum. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips as she moved towards the door, each step slow, deliberate. Her breath caught as she reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling. She hesitated, her mind swirling with questions, doubts, and a rising sense of dread. Could it be a prank? A neighbor trying to get her attention? But deep down, she knew this wasn't normal. There was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about the way the knock reverberated through the silence. And then, as if answering her unspoken question, the voice came. It was not loud, but it was undeniable, cold, steady. "Marissa, open the door. We know you're in there." The words hit her like a slap, sending a shockwave through her body. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, every muscle in her body locked in place. She knew the voice. She knew the voice. But it wasn't possible. The voice. It wasn't anyone she knew, not anyone she had ever heard before. It was cold, empty, as if it came from somewhere beyond the realm of the living. Her mouth went dry, and she pulled her hand away from the doorknob, her body trembling with fear. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, pressing in on her chest as she struggled to breathe. There was a feeling of pressure, an invisible weight bearing down on her from all sides. She stepped backward, her eyes never leaving the door, her mind a swirl of panic and confusion. And then it came again, the knock, louder, faster, almost frantic now. Her heart leapt into her throat as she felt the door shudder in its frame. Someone, or something, was on the other side, and it was waiting for her. But what did it want? Without thinking, she turned and bolted toward the stairs, her feet pounding against the wooden floor. She didn't know where she was going, she didn't know what to do, but all she knew was that she had to get away. She reached the stairs and skidded to a halt. The hallway beyond was impossibly long, stretching into darkness. And yet, at the end of that hallway, something was waiting. It was just a shadow at first, an indistinct figure standing in the dark. But as her eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. A figure, tall, thin, and featureless. And then it spoke, its voice a low, distorted hiss that sent shivers down her spine. "Marissa, you can't escape." Her body stiffened, her blood running cold. If you're enjoying the suspense so far, give this video a thumbs up and share it with anyone who loves a good mystery. You never know who might need a little thrill tonight. Marissa's body felt like lead as she backed away from the shadow in the hallway, her eyes locked on its impossible form. The figure was still there, just standing at the end of the long corridor, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't a person. It couldn't have been. No one would stand so still, so perfectly unmoving in the dead of night. Her heart pounded in her chest, a chaotic rhythm that seemed to reverberate in the very air around her. She tried to take a step back, but her legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had turned to quicksand. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, to get away from the figure that now filled the space with an almost palpable sense of dread. But her feet were frozen to the floor. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, as though something in the house had locked her in place. The shadow didn't speak, but its presence was enough to fill the entire hallway. It radiated an aura of darkness, an oppressive weight that hung in the air, suffocating her. Every part of her screamed for escape, but she couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the figure, and as much as she tried to tear herself away, it was like her body refused to cooperate. The longer she stood there, the harder it became to breathe. Then, just as the silence seemed to stretch into an eternity, the figure stirred. It was slow, almost deliberate, as if it was toying with her fear. The air seemed to crackle with an energy she couldn't describe, and then the figure stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural. "Marissa." The voice came again, but it was different this time. It wasn't the low, cold whisper she had heard before. This time, the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air. The sound of her name was no longer a simple utterance. It was a command, a beckoning, an invitation she couldn't refuse. The walls seemed to bend inward, the shadows growing deeper, darker, until they swallowed the light entirely. The hallway was now a black void, a cavern of night where there was no escape. The air was thick with a musty, damp smell that burned her nostrils, and Marissa felt her breath catch in her throat. She stumbled backward, finally able to move, her legs shaking beneath her. She turned toward the stairs, the only way out, and in that moment, her mind screamed one thought above all else: get out. Get out now. But as she reached the foot of the stairs, a sharp, agonizing screech filled the air, a sound that reverberated through the very walls of the house. It was like the cry of something in pain, something that had been trapped for too long. Marissa's heart nearly stopped as she whipped around, her eyes searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Nothing but the deep, suffocating darkness that had taken over the house. Her hands shook as she reached for the banister, feeling the cold, smooth wood beneath her fingers. She needed to get to safety. She needed to get to the attic. That's where she'd be safe. Her mind raced, trying to think of any way she could escape this nightmarish nightmare. But as her foot hit the first step, the voice came again. It was louder now, more insistent. "Marissa," it whispered, the sound filling every corner of the house. "You can't run from me. You can never escape." The words were a poison, slowly creeping into her thoughts, planting themselves like seeds of doubt and fear. They clawed at her, wrapping themselves around her mind until they clouded her thoughts entirely. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly before her, and the weight of the house seemed to bear down on her, pushing her down into the darkness. She couldn't think. She couldn't focus. The walls were closing in, and the air itself felt thick with the oppressive presence of the figure. She turned back toward the hallway, but the darkness there seemed even deeper now, swallowing the light from the stairs. The figure had moved closer, its form more defined, and its eyes, if it even had eyes, burned with an unholy glow. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel it staring at her, the weight of its gaze like a physical thing pressing against her chest. It was a force of nature, a presence that seemed to consume everything in its path. Suddenly, she heard a sound from behind her. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. It was a low, guttural sound, a growl almost, as if something deep within the house was waking. Marissa's blood ran cold, and before she could stop herself, her feet were already moving, taking her back down the hallway toward the living room. Her breath was ragged as she ran, her pulse roaring in her ears. The door was locked, but the back door, it was always unlocked. If she could just get outside, if she could just make it to the yard, maybe, just maybe, she could outrun whatever was in the house. But as she reached for the door, the growl grew louder, more feral, until it seemed to reverberate in her very bones. She froze, her hand on the door handle. Something was wrong, so wrong. The house was no longer a place she recognized. The air felt alive, as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. The door rattled in its frame, a violent shake that sent a jolt of fear through her entire body. The sound of the growl had intensified, and now she could hear something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. Marissa's hand fell away from the door handle as she turned to face the living room. There, standing just beyond the threshold of the door, was the figure. This time, it was more defined. She could see the outline of its body, tall, thin, and impossibly elongated. Its arms hung at odd angles, as if they were joints of twisted metal. Its head was a mass of shifting shadows, no real features, just an endless void that seemed to suck in the light around it. And its eyes, God, those eyes. They burned with an unearthly blood-red glow that seemed to pierce through the very air. "You can't leave," the voice hissed, and this time Marissa could feel the cold breath on the back of her neck. "Not until I'm done with you." The words crawled over her skin, making her shiver uncontrollably. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, to throw herself out of the door and into the cold night, but her body refused to obey. She was paralyzed. The shadows in the room twisted, elongated, crawling toward her, and suddenly she realized she wasn't just in a house anymore. This wasn't her home. It was a prison, a trap, and it was closing in on her. Marissa's legs felt as though they had turned to stone, her body no longer responding to the frantic commands of her mind. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat like a war drum, drowning out the sound of the growling that seemed to come from all around her. The figure, that thing, stood motionless, but its presence filled every inch of the room, its very being distorting the air. There was a heaviness now, a tangible pressure that weighed down on her chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. For a brief moment, Marissa thought she could hear the distant sounds of traffic outside, the soft murmur of the town, the crickets, the rustling trees. But it was all gone now. The house had become an impenetrable void, a place suspended in some kind of purgatory. Time no longer seemed to exist here. She could feel the shadows creeping around her like thick, tar-like liquid, wrapping themselves around her feet, pulling at her ankles. She tried to step back, but the shadows were relentless, thick and suffocating, clinging to her, pulling her into the very ground. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, as though the air itself was suffocating her voice. Her lungs burned for oxygen, but it was as if she were breathing in smoke, every breath growing harder and harder. The figure in the doorway began to move again, its limbs snapping unnaturally, bending at impossible angles, like broken, twisted branches. Its movement was slow, deliberate, an eerie, jerky motion that defied any logic of physics. Every step it took was heavy, as if the weight of the entire universe was pressing down on its being. The black void that made up its form seemed to pulse, and Marissa thought she saw something in it, something shifting, something alive. "Marissa." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just in her ears, it was in her mind. It pushed into her thoughts, slipping inside like an invasive parasite, taking root in her brain. "You belong to me now. I've been waiting for so long." Her body trembled uncontrollably as she stumbled back further, the shadows dragging at her heels. The figure stepped forward, its presence so overwhelming that she could feel the walls of the house quivering around her, as though the entire structure was alive. The temperature dropped sharply, a cold so deep it felt like the very marrow in her bones was freezing solid. Marissa's mind spun wildly, each thought clashing with the next. She was trapped. There was no way out. The door to the living room was now blocked by that thing, and the hallway had become a labyrinth of twisting shadows. She could see the faint outline of the stairs in the distance, but every time she tried to move toward them, the figure seemed to grow closer, its steps faster, its dark form filling the space in front of her. The air felt thick and suffocating, like being submerged underwater. "Please," she gasped, the word slipping from her lips as if it had been clawing its way out for a long time. "Please, just leave me alone." The figure stopped. The room went still. Marissa's breath came in shallow, desperate gasps as she clung to the wall, trying to steady herself. Her fingers dug into the peeling wallpaper, her knuckles white. Her chest burned with the effort of keeping herself from collapsing, but every breath she took felt like she was breathing in broken glass. Then the figure spoke again. This time, its voice was different. It was softer, almost gentle, but it was not comforting. No, it was the kind of voice that made your skin crawl, the kind that made you feel as though you were being manipulated, bent to something far darker than you could comprehend. "You don't remember me, do you?" it whispered, its voice dripping with mock sympathy. "But I've been with you for so long, watching you, waiting for you to understand." Marissa's mind reeled. What does that mean, she thought, her head spinning as the shadows seemed to close in even tighter, twisting around her like a living, suffocating blanket. "You are mine now," the figure said again, its words now dripping with malevolent pleasure. "There is no escape. You're part of this place, and you always have been." Marissa's breath hitched as her vision blurred. She stumbled forward, trying to find the strength to push through the overwhelming terror that gripped her. She couldn't let it win. She had to get out. There has to be a way. Her mind screamed for her to run, to find some way to escape. But there was no escape. The walls had closed in. The house had become a prison, and she was the captive. Her eyes darted to the window, the only possible way to flee. But the glass seemed to shimmer unnaturally, distorting the view beyond it, like a funhouse mirror. There was no freedom outside. There was no safety. This was it. The figure took another step forward, its form now filling the hallway completely. Marissa felt her legs shake beneath her, the weight of the presence pressing on her like a vice. She was drowning in it. There was no more air, no more light. Just darkness, only darkness. And then, in the midst of her panic, a thought broke through. The attic. Her mind clung to it like a lifeline. It was the only place in the house she hadn't explored in years. The only place she hadn't checked since her parents had passed. The attic had always been locked, always out of reach. But maybe it was her only chance now. Without thinking, Marissa turned and sprinted toward the stairs, ignoring the way the shadows seemed to snap at her heels, eager to drag her down into the depths. She reached the staircase and grabbed the banister with both hands, her fingers slipping with sweat. Her pulse was a wild drumbeat in her ears as she scrambled up the steps, her feet stumbling over each other. She reached the top of the stairs, and the hallway stretched out in front of her. She could see the door to the attic at the far end, just beyond the shadows. It was her only option. There was no other choice. With a cry of desperation, she raced toward the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But as she reached for the handle, the growl returned, louder, more insistent, more terrifying than before. The very walls around her seemed to tremble with the force of it. "No!" Marissa whimpered, her fingers fumbling for the key in her pocket. "No, not now." She fumbled with the key, her hands slick with sweat, but it wouldn't fit. Her heart hammered in her chest as she fought to get the lock open, the growling louder and louder. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel someone, breathing down her neck. The door to the attic creaked open just as the darkness closed in around her. A wave of cold, stale air swept over her face, and she recoiled, but there was no time to think. She shoved the door open wide and dashed inside, slamming it behind her. The attic was cold, dark, and dusty, filled with forgotten memories and the scent of mildew. The air was thick with the weight of years of neglect, but it was better than being out there in the hallway with that thing. Marissa leaned against the door, gasping for breath. Her whole body trembled. She wasn't safe. She knew that. She couldn't outrun it forever, but she had to hold on. She couldn't let it win, not yet. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The shadows in the corner of the attic. They were moving. What do you think Marissa should do next? Is she trapped, or can she find a way out? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Let's see what you think of this growing mystery. Marissa stood frozen in the center of the attic, her breath shallow, the air in the small, cramped space thick with the smell of decay. The darkness here was like no other she had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt like the shadows themselves were alive, swirling, watching. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her felt like an echo that bounced back from some distant, forgotten corner of the house. And yet, despite the suffocating weight of the atmosphere, she couldn't bring herself to move. Her fingers gripped the edge of the door, her knuckles white, as the last echo of her frantic footsteps still rang in her mind. It was safer here. She had to believe that. She had to hold on to that hope, no matter how fragile it seemed. But there was something in the corners of the room, something waiting. The shadows in the farthest reaches of the attic seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if they were drawing closer. Marissa closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady herself. She could feel the blood rushing in her ears, could feel the pounding of her heart beneath her ribs. It was the only sound now, the only thing that reminded her she was alive. But even that seemed like a cruel mockery, a reminder of how little time she might have left before everything came crashing down. Think, Marissa. You have to think. Her mind raced, trying to grasp at something, anything, that could give her an answer. She couldn't stay here forever. The attic was a dead end, a trap in its own right. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, each moment stretching into eternity. The shadows in the corners were moving. She saw them, not just the darkened areas where the light from the small window couldn't reach. No, the shadows themselves were shifting, twisting, as though something was moving beneath the surface. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't going crazy. The house was changing. The shadows were alive. Slowly, almost too slowly to notice, the shadows began to form shapes. At first they were amorphous, vague outlines that seemed to flicker and bend. But then, as though reacting to her fear, the shapes began to take more definite form. The darkened shapes twisted, lengthened, and contorted in unnatural ways. They took on the vague shape of human figures, tall, skeletal, and looming. But the more she looked, the less they resembled people at all. The longer she stared, the more they seemed to shift, as though they were made of something far more disturbing than simple darkness. She could hear a low, hissing sound coming from them. It was almost like whispering, but deeper, more guttural. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had been hidden for far too long, something that had waited in the dark for its moment to strike. Her entire body tensed, every muscle coiled with fear. She knew that if she didn't act, if she didn't get away, she would be swallowed whole by whatever these things were. Without thinking, she turned toward the far wall, eyes darting to the small window above. A sliver of moonlight filtered through the grime-covered glass, casting a pale glow over the dusty floorboards. There was a rope hanging from the rafters, used for pulling down the ladder to the attic when it was stored away. Her mind screamed at her to use it, to escape. But even as she thought the words, she knew it wasn't that simple. The air grew colder still, the temperature plummeting so quickly it took her breath away. The shadows grew darker, and the shapes began to stretch toward her, creeping slowly along the floor, their limbs moving like something that didn't quite belong in the natural world. It wasn't just darkness anymore. The shadows had substance, they had presence, and that presence was malevolent. She could feel it, a deep, crawling dread that twisted in her gut, making her feel sick. Her heart raced and she stumbled backward, away from the crawling shapes. There was no way out. The attic door had closed behind her with a sickening thud, the sound of it locking itself, if it was even possible for a door to lock by itself, echoing through the room. Her hand moved instinctively to the doorknob, but it was no use. The door didn't budge. Why was this happening? The question hit her like a slap to the face. She wasn't supposed to be trapped here. This wasn't her fault. She had done everything right, hadn't she? She had followed all the rules, all the things she had been taught to do. And yet, none of it mattered. Nothing mattered now. The shadows were closing in. There was no escape. The whispering grew louder, the hissing sounds multiplying as the figures in the shadows seemed to take on form. Marissa's eyes widened in terror as she watched them move, not just towards her, through the room. The shadows split and merged, forming new shapes with each passing second. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. Everything was bending, shifting, warping in ways that were impossible to understand. "Marissa," the voice came again, but this time it wasn't just the shadows. It was coming from within her mind, invading her thoughts, worming its way into her consciousness. It was no longer just a voice, it was a presence, filling every corner of her mind. It was inside her. "I've been waiting for so long. You can't escape now. You belong to me." The words sent a shock of ice through her veins. She could feel her fingers trembling, her knees buckling beneath her as the full weight of the truth hit her. It knows me. It knows everything about me. She hadn't even realized it at first, how close it had been, how carefully it had been watching. But now she understood. This thing, this presence, had been with her all along. It had been waiting for her to reach this point, waiting for her to slip into this dark abyss of fear. And now that she was here, now that it had her, there would be no way out. It wasn't a question of whether she could escape. It was a question of whether she would survive. The room was closing in on her. The shadows were pressing in from all sides, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, until they were a deafening cacophony in her mind. She could feel the air growing thicker, harder to breathe, as though the very atmosphere was suffocating her. She reached out for the rope, for any way to escape, but her hands trembled so badly that she couldn't grip it. The shadows moved closer. One of them, tall, grotesque, its limbs like twisted branches, reached out for her. It was slow, deliberate, and yet impossibly fast at the same time, a blur of darkness that covered the distance between them in the blink of an eye. The fingers stretched toward her, their long, jagged tips scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. Marissa screamed and stumbled back, tripping over the old, forgotten belongings piled in the attic. She didn't know where she was running. There was no escape. There was nowhere to go. The darkness was swallowing everything around her, and all she could hear was the sound of her own panicked breathing and the whispers, the constant, insistent whispers. But then, something happened. As the shadows closed in on her, a sharp light pierced the darkness. It was brief, a flash of pure white that cut through the blackness like a blade. The whispers stopped. The shadows halted. Everything stood still. Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she was hallucinating, but the light seemed to come from the far corner of the attic, where there had been nothing but dark, oppressive void just moments before. It flickered like a candle, then intensified, casting a strange glow over the space. And then, a voice, this time, not the one from the shadows, but a different one. A voice that was familiar, soft, comforting. Marissa, wake up. The light flickered again, more erratically this time, as if it were struggling against the overwhelming darkness around it. Marissa's pulse quickened as she stared at the faint glow emanating from the corner. It was so bright, yet its warmth seemed to only make the surrounding shadows more suffocating, more menacing. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to flee from the flickering light, because the shadows were still there, still crawling toward her, waiting for her to make a mistake. But the light, it was different. It wasn't from the shadows. There was something oddly familiar about it, something almost comforting about the way it held its position, flickering like a candle in the wind, steady but fragile. It felt like an anchor in a storm, something that wasn't part of the nightmare around her. And then, the voice came again. Marissa, wake up. The voice wasn't as loud as the others had been, but it was clearer, more distinct. Marissa's breath hitched in her throat, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Wake up. But she wasn't asleep. She couldn't be. She was trapped in this house, surrounded by things that shouldn't be real, things that should have never existed in the first place. The light flickered again, a sudden burst of brightness that forced her to close her eyes against the overwhelming intensity. When she opened them again, the figure in the corner was gone. The shadows had receded, leaving the space eerily calm. The room, once filled with malevolent shapes and crawling darkness, was now empty, save for the faint light that still clung to the far corner like a desperate survivor. Marissa stepped forward cautiously, unsure if this sudden reprieve was a trick. She had learned not to trust the house, not to trust the things that hid within its walls. Everything here was designed to deceive, to twist reality until she could no longer tell where the nightmare ended and the waking world began. As she moved closer to the light, the atmosphere around her seemed to shift. The oppressive weight that had pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe, seemed to lighten. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marissa could take in a deep breath without it feeling like her lungs were being crushed. She took another step forward, then another, until she was standing just a few feet away from the source of the light. It wasn't a lamp. It wasn't a fire. It was something else. Something entirely unnatural. The light was coming from a large mirror, its frame dark and ornate, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The glass itself didn't reflect the room behind her, nor did it reflect her own face. Instead, the surface of the mirror shimmered with a strange, liquid quality, as if the glass were alive, moving in subtle ripples. Marissa's hand instinctively reached for the mirror. She didn't know why. It was as if her body had already decided that this was her only option, the only thing left in this world that could offer her any sort of escape from the nightmare that had consumed her. Her fingers brushed against the glass, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, without warning, the glass gave way beneath her touch, It was like pushing through the surface of water, the mirror rippling outward in a concentric pattern, creating a distortion in the air that made her dizzy. The shadows in the room flinched, retreating momentarily from the center of the room, as if recoiling from the mirror's power. "Marissa," the voice spoke again, now soft but insistent, as if beckoning her to cross the threshold. "Come closer." She didn't hesitate this time. Her fear, her confusion, her panic, all of it faded into the background as something more powerful took hold of her. There was a pull, an urge, a need to step forward, to enter whatever lay beyond the mirror. It felt like a sanctuary, a refuge from the terror that had consumed her mind for so long. With a trembling breath, Marissa stepped into the mirror. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as though the world around her dissolved in an instant, the floor beneath her feet vanishing, the walls of the attic falling away. She was falling, weightless, suspended in some kind of endless void. But there was no fear this time. There was only a deep, enveloping calm. And then, suddenly she was standing again. The ground beneath her was solid, the world around her still. But this was no longer the attic of the house. It was something else. She was in a different place entirely. The air was thick with mist, the faint scent of damp earth hanging in the atmosphere. The space stretched out before her, vast and endless, a landscape of desolation. Tall, gnarled trees loomed in the distance, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like fingers, grasping for something she couldn't see. The sky above was an unnatural shade of gray, swirling with dark clouds that seemed to pulse with a kind of malevolent energy. She looked around, her eyes scanning the new surroundings. There was no sign of the house. There were no signs of anything familiar. The landscape stretched out in all directions, an endless expanse of darkness and mist. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The voice responded, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It filled the space around her, echoing in every corner of the world. It was everywhere. "You're where you've always belonged," it said, its tone reverberating through the air. "Welcome home." Marissa's heart stopped. Home. This wasn't home. This was a nightmare, a place that shouldn't exist. She had escaped one hell only to find herself trapped in another, more twisted reality. The shadows, the whispers, they had followed her here, hadn't they? They had always been here, lurking just beyond the veil of reality, waiting for her to slip. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned around. There, at the edge of the mist, she saw something moving, a figure barely visible through the fog. It was too far away to make out clearly, but there was something about it that made her stomach churn. It moved closer, slowly at first, then faster, until it was standing right in front of her. And when the figure stepped into the dim light, she could see it clearly. It was her, but it wasn't. The figure in front of her was a twisted version of herself. Its face was hollow, its skin stretched thin, its eyes wide and unblinking, filled with a dark, empty void. The figure grinned, a smile that was too wide, too unnatural. The corners of its mouth stretched impossibly far, and it leaned in toward her, the stench of decay filling the air. "You were always meant to be here," it hissed, its voice distorted and hollow. "You are mine, Marissa. You always have been." Did you enjoy the twist in this story? Want to find out what happens next? Don't forget to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the bell so you never miss another terrifying tale. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.